Thank you. Thanks. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here with you this morning. Before I jump in too far, if there's anyone that came in late and needs these handouts, please, there you go. Please make sure that you grab those because we will be using them as we go through today. How is everybody feeling this morning? Awesome. Excited to be here? Good, so am I. This is such an important topic and one that is very near and dear to my heart, and I've spent the last 10 years or so working on it. And I absolutely love how challenging it is, and I think you do too, and that's probably why you're here, which is great. I want to ask you to do something sort of unconventional before we get going. I want to have everybody stand up. And I'd like for you to move about the room and high five 5 people. Good. Bonuses are encouraged. All right. Thank you for doing that. I had you do it for a couple of reasons, but primarily because you're all awesome. You wouldn't be here if you weren't, and this is something that I think is really important, and there's so many universities and so many faculty and administrators that have not thought about this as a really great opportunity, that have thought about international students as being problematic. And I think you don't feel that way, and that's why you're here. That's why I'm here too. And so I really want to thank you and wanted you to sort of give yourselves a little bit of a pat on the back for doing that. Can everyone hear me okay without amplification? Okay, great, excellent. So what I want to do is talk you through what I'm hoping for us to cover in the next 45 minutes or so. I want us to think a little bit about our own cultural lens. We all have one. We bring it with us everywhere we go. And I want to have us actually create one. We're going to do that first thing. Then I want to talk about some of the challenges that we've all kind of experienced in welcoming and really engaging international students in the classroom. Then we'll go in to do a little bit of self-assessment. Where are you now in terms of engaging international students in the classroom or with academic programs? Then we'll talk about the good stuff, ideas, solutions that I've got for you. I think you're going to have some for me, which is really great, and we'll all sort of have a conversation about that. And then finally, I want to take at least 5 minutes at the end here and have you think about what things you can kind of do going forward. None of this is worthwhile if we can't make changes as a result of it. So I want to make sure we have some dedicated time to do that at the end. Okay. So everyone should have in front of them this sheet. Go ahead and pull that out. What I want to have you do with this sheet is create your own sort of personal cultural lens, okay? We all have one. It's something that we bring with us everywhere we go and influences everything we see and do. Every single one of them is different. And I want you to take a minute to think about what yours looks like. We're going to actually create one. On the, I don't have a pointer here. On the far left for you, think about exposures you've had, experiences you've had that have maybe impacted kind of the way that you tend to view people that are different from you, right, or other cultures. For me, a really big one, the first one that I have written down here, my dad traveled internationally for work all the time. And that means that from a very young age, the idea of international travel was normalized to me. It was easy. The idea of thinking about engaging with another culture, done. Not something I ever had to really think about purposefully, right? It may be different for you. Study abroad experiences I've had, international business experiences I've had have certainly shaped the way that I tend to approach intercultural situations. Then I want you to think about some of your thoughts on your own culture, and you can define that however you want. Here, I've made this sort of benign because you're all looking at it. But I've sort of just thought about myself as a US American, right? One thing that I really like about US culture is that there's food from everywhere. And one thing that I really like is freedom of speech, right? I'm a big believer in that. So that's not something everywhere has, right? So that's something that I really value. Over here, I want you to think about some thoughts you have about other cultures. This could be good or bad. This is not something you're gonna have to share with anyone else. So this can be really honest with yourself. What are some thoughts you have? For me, I've spent a ton of time studying China educational system, so I have a lot of thoughts and a lot of judgments about it, right? So I have to be honest with myself about that. Here I say that I think the educational system there creates great math students, but does not build critical thinking skills, which I think are important. And that's a judgment I know that I have. On the bottom, think about what your support system is. These are the people that are influencing you every day, that are helping you through difficult situations, and are certainly coloring your view of the world in some way, right? You know, you can hash that out however you want. You can draw a picture, make a list, whatever you want to do. And finally, kind of a snapshot of how you see yourself, right? And, you know, like I said, mine had to be sort of benign because you're all looking at it. Yours is just for you. So be honest with yourself and really kind of think about where you feel like you are right now at this moment in time, okay? So just take about 5 minutes to fill out your cultural lens. And just leave this circle part blank in the middle. Just don't write over that. You can think about how religion plays into some of this, how race plays into some of this, whatever's kind of on your mind, whatever pops in there. Just be honest with yourself and know that you will not have to show this to a single person. And take just one more minute to get down a few final thoughts. And you can certainly go back to it later, too. Okay, hopefully you got at least a thing or two down in each box. Is that a fair assessment? Everyone feels like they got at least a few kind of key things down? Okay, here's what I want to have you do. Grab your sheet and take your pen or pencil and actually poke a hole through where this circle is right here. All right. Now hold it up in front of you so that what you've just written is kind of in front of your face, like this, okay? And using that little hole, I want you to find me. So look at me through that little hole. Okay, is everyone able to see me? Okay. Do you think you're all seeing me the same way? Right. This is sort of a like crude, obvious thing, right? But of course you're not, right? Because of that cultural lens that you're holding up in front of you, right? That means that some of you may have some thoughts about me based on the way I look, maybe based on the fact that I'm from Duke. Everyone hates Duke basketball, right? Except for Duke. So it may be that you have some preconceived notions about me because of that. Maybe because of, you know, something I said earlier, because of the bio, you have some thoughts about me, right? And I think it's really important just to think about the fact that these lenses come with us while we're looking at and examining kind of the way that we approach international students as well, right? And I think it's really important to be in touch with what is I'm coloring this situation, right? What are the things that are maybe impacting the way that I'm thinking about this situation? That's going to be a little bit different for all of us, but it's something I think it's really key to be aware of, and that's kind of why I had us do this to kind of begin with. If you didn't get a chance to fully fill it out, I would encourage you to maybe do that at a later time, because I do think it's a useful, worthwhile exercise. Okay, so let's jump in and talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we, you know, collectively, I think, as educators and administrators face when we're working with international students. But I do want to say two kind of quick level-setting things before we do. One is that I think sometimes, I think political correctness is a great thing and it needs to be in place, but I also think sometimes it can make it so that we have a really hard time acknowledging or talking about difference, right? It can make us really, really afraid of saying the wrong thing. And so I think it's really important that as long as we're coming at these differences from a place of curiosity and with good intent, I think it's important to recognize them and talk about them. The other quick thing I want to say is that I think when we talk about international students or people from anywhere, it can feel really uncomfortable to make generalizations, you know, or stereotypes, you know, as we're talking about people from a particular place. But I also think to some extent we're going to have to do a little bit of that in order to develop programs for these students. I would love nothing more than for us to come up with an individual action plan for every student we're dealing with. That's not going to happen, right? So to some extent, even though, of course, you know, we honor that everybody is coming through these things, you know, coming through this kind of situation individually, we do sort of have to make some generalizations when we talk about the students. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So I just want to give you a quick kind of look at the student population that I'm dealing with so you'll understand my perspective. So this is the Master of Engineering Management program at Duke. These are the students that graduated last year. There's about 150 of them every year. A couple of them are not pictured here. They're really diverse, and they're highly international. So this program is between 80 and 90% international students. So I'm dealing regularly with very, very large numbers of international students. Of those numbers, half of those international students are from India, a quarter are from China, and a quarter are from the rest of the world. So there's a lot of really interesting things going on there, right? We've got this one huge population that's coming in. We've got this other sort of big population that has its own unique set of challenges. And then we have all these kind of onesie-twosie students who don't necessarily have kind of a home base. And so that has really colored a lot of the way that I have thought about how to put together programs and support systems for students. As Melanie mentioned in my intro, I did extensive research on Chinese students, so you will hear me talk about that fairly extensively. I understand that is a large population that you're working with at Murray State as well, so I hope that'll be helpful. So over the course of the past 10 years or so, I have dealt with a large number of challenges, and I think you probably have too. I tend to sort of think about them in two different buckets. So in terms of classroom and academics, you know, most of these international students are coming from a place that has very different classroom expectations. So most of them are coming from a very teacher-centered classroom where the idea is that the teacher is imparting knowledge on the student, they are soaking it up and then, you know, regurgitating it on a test, right? That's an important part of learning, but it's not necessarily what we teach here, right? And so for those students, we can't just and suddenly say, no, now you need to think critically about this. So this is a really important distinction and difference. Class participation looks very, very different for an international student than it probably does for a domestic student who has been trained to question things, right, and been trained to sort of think out loud and give answers. Faculty interactions are very different. You are all so much more intimidating to an international student than you are to a domestic one, generally. And that's something to keep in mind, too. Group work is often new and very challenging for international students. There's a whole slew of things that we'll talk about later that kind of go along with the group work dynamics that can be challenging. Choosing classes is actually really new for a lot of international students. This is something I never even thought about. But for the most part, folks are coming from a situation where classes have been assigned to them or their parents have made that decision for them. So coming to the US and suddenly choosing electives can be a really high stress situation. In terms of daily life, social expectations are probably really different. When you're dealing with demographics like I am, where I talked about how we have sort of these large pockets of international students from specific places, it is hard to get students to interact outside those groups, right? And I understand why those groups are appealing. If I came here and English was my second language and I was really exhausted from having to speak English all day, I would much rather hang out with my Chinese friends at the end of the day. I get it, right? But we need to find ways to sort of help these students interact with each other. Time management is also generally really new. Like I said, a lot of these students are coming from much more kind of prescriptive situations. And so that can be really new, and that independence can actually be kind of frightening. Housing logistics are totally new and different. For my students, they're graduate students, not have on-campus graduate student housing, which means they have to find an apartment and they have to furnish it. There are no furnished apartments in Durham, North Carolina. So, you know, these are new and different things that students are dealing with. And certainly daily transactions, right? Anything, you know, even just going to the grocery store, when someone says paper or plastic, you're an international student, you have no idea how to answer that question, right? I would love to hear from you. Do you feel like these are the sorts of challenges you are facing? Yeah? Any others you want to add? Plagiarism? Mm-hmm. Yep. In terms of?
They see it sometimes as a negotiation.
Do you feel that just with your international students or with your millennial students too? Okay, interesting. We get both at Duke. A lot of it. Okay, yes.
You know, I'm dealing with all those issues when I teach the international students, but I also feel like all those issues, they're fairly cosmetic. I'm dealing with somewhat more fundamental issues. For example, in some cultures, you get jobs based on your gender, based on your
Totally.
language, based
Yep.
on your family connections.
Yep.
How do you explain to somebody that he actually needs to study a course when he comes and says, look, I already have a job lined out in front of me. One student told me I just need a purchase certificate. That's exactly what he said. Like, purchase certificate to get promoted, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, how do you motivate somebody to study when he has a role, I mean, his priorities
Yeah.
are different, and it's kind of overreaches like all those issues.
Yeah, that is tough. I mean, I think I don't necessarily have a perfect answer for that. I mean, I think the main thing is modeling, right? And sort of sharing examples of that's not really how it works here, right? So you need to understand, maybe career services can come in and kind of explain to the students, like, no, you need to understand you will absolutely not get a job unless A, B, and C happens. That doesn't necessarily fix the problem, but I mean, I think we have to talk about it and address it head on. Where are those students coming from that you feel like you... Okay. But do you feel like it's from specific places where that's happening and being problematic?
Well, from a specific part of the world.
Yeah.
Right? It's different where education is one of the last priorities.
Sure, yeah.
The top list includes religion, family,
Right.
connections,
Right.
all those things.
Yeah.
Education is somewhere at the bottom.
Yeah, that's hard because we can't flip a switch, right? And say, no, you need to understand from this, you know. But I think context is the best thing we can do in those sorts of situations, for sure. I think some of the stuff we'll talk about later might help address some of this too, so we'll put a pin in it. But yeah, that is heavy. It's tough, yeah.
So similarly, administratively, we get some students who think that the rules can be bargained with. So there's a lot of rules that are based on accreditation.
Yep.
And, just regulations that we have about what you have to do to graduate.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an impression that you can bargain your way out of certain rules.
Yes, exceptionalism at its finest, yes. Yep, we deal with a lot of that too. It's a tough one. We have really struggled with that, and I think that also plays very much into the plagiarism cheating stuff too, right? Where it's really hard to help students kind of believe, like, no, there are actual consequences for this to happen. The only thing that we have really gotten very much traction with is we have had a couple of students who have been caught plagiarizing or, you know, working groups where they shouldn't have, or things like that, who have had, you know, very real consequences. They have been kicked out for 2 semesters, maybe longer. And they have, strangely, I'm still kind of surprised that this has happened, many of them have been willing to talk to other international students about their experience. And although it was a little bit of a tough sell at the beginning, many of them said that in the long run, it was actually very therapeutic for them to talk about it with other people and to feel like they were helping them not make the same mistake. Because I think you do learn a hard lesson when you know, have to go home for 2 semesters and your work visa has to sort of start all over again, right? If you're looking for an internship here. I mean, it's tough. So I think, you know, any kind of sort of modeling or example that you can show where, no, this really does matter and this really could impact you. And I think the person is to that person's, you know, kind of understanding of how the world works, the more impact I think that that has. Mm-hmm. Sure. Both sides, I think, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Or when it even comes time for preparing for tests and things like that, now because we're concerned about cheating, you might have to take 8 different versions of a
Yep.
test kind of thing.
Yep.
So the time, faculty time has become huge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then we have certain expectations, and it comes under expectations. We want everybody to have a minimal level of competency to be able to graduate.
Mm-hmm.
And what we find is we spend so much time trying to adjust to the international population that it almost changes what our expectations are of what people need to know.
For everybody. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like that's a conversation that is happening with admissions? Because I do feel like there's a loop there, right, of people that are maybe coming in and not necessarily, yeah, not necessarily coming in ready to hit the ground running, as it were.
Chronicles of higher education. They're basically saying a lot of universities in the Midwest, because of declining population, they're getting a lot of international students.
Yep.
To get more money, more students.
Yep.
But faculty are basically saying to teach international students, it doubles your teaching rate. So there needs to be like a fairer distribution between your income and our workload.
Yep, absolutely. And that's a big, I did some consulting at Michigan State a few years ago where they're having that exact problem and huge numbers. I mean, I think it was something like 3,000 coming in every semester along those lines and having to do just ESL work before they start academic work. And even then, still sort of behind where they needed to be. And that's not I mean, I think that's a big challenge that all of us are dealing with. I'll talk a little bit later about some of the things that we have done in the programs that I work with at Duke to address it. A lot of it has really been working with admissions, which I think, you know, doing interviews with students before they come and language testing beyond just looking at the test of English as a foreign language or at GRE or SAT or whatever test they're taking to get in here. Those have been proven to not be great indicators of success or great predictors of success. And so I think it's really important that we look at things kind of beyond that before we ask students to come here and spend money, right, on a program that they may not be able to be successful in. Mm-hmm. Not directly, no. I know that some of our students are dealing with agents and then kind of reaching out to us directly, but nope. Nope, we do, most of our international stuff in terms of admissions is done via Skype with individual students where they have to hold up an ID, you know. Mm-hmm. We do, and you know, and now in the program that I work with, domestic students as well, because you know, like I talked about the demographics I'm dealing with, for a lot of our domestic students, they're about to be in a situation for the first time in their lives, they are a racial minority. And so we really want to make sure that they are ready and prepared for that, and embracing of that before they come. So yeah, we do, we interview everybody. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. I experienced the same thing. I don't have an answer for it other than frustration and, you know, and I think I have found that there are some, and I hope, gentlemen, that you're listening up here, I think there are some male faculty who can be really good allies in those situations too, to be like, no, listen to Bridget. Like, she's teaching this class for a reason. listen to what she's saying. And I hate that that has to happen, but I do feel that that's helpful in some cases for students to be like, oh, all right, you know. Yeah, I hear you and feel you. Yeah, yeah.
Problem just getting groups of students when they do group work. They'll have the male-female incompatibility, and sometimes you have to step in as an instructor and just say, look,
Mm-hmm.
this is the group you're in. You got to deal with it and handle the situation.
Yep.
Sometimes they're not happy.
Well,
They get the work.
yeah. I mean, in the real world, we're not getting to choose our teams based on gender in the workplace usually, so.
And then you also take the student, the female student aside and say, look, this is the group, and there's a cultural difference. So you may have to get outside of your normal comfort level of just kind of talking with somebody and be a little more assertive and say, here's what I'm telling you to do, get it done. Especially if you put that female student in the leadership role. And it's very, very interesting.
But it's important to keep doing, for sure.
So, when you're talking prospective international students
Mm-hmm.
coming,
Yeah.
is this an issue that you specifically address?
Sexism? No, but we definitely talk about sort of diversity and interacting with diverse groups, if that makes sense. And so sometimes it'll come out in those situations, and it'll be clear that that may be a challenge for a particular student. But no, we don't address it directly. Perhaps we should. It's hard to do, because I think everybody knows the right answer to say. You know what I mean? So it's kind of a hard, you know, I think if you just say, are you sexist? People are going to be like, no, of course not, you know, so. No, I know. I'm just trying to think about how we might get at it, yeah.
Are you aware that you will have to interact professionally with
Mm-hmm.
females?
Yeah,
I mean, everybody will say what they think they need.
sure, yeah. Yeah, it's a good thought. I may suggest it for our next round of interviews for sure. Because it is, I mean, it's a major issue for sure in some cultures especially.
Interview every single international student before they
And
admit it to you.
we, so we actually split it up a little bit because not all, you know, admissions would not be able to handle all of that, especially in kind of a short time crunch. So we spread it out, and all of us over the course of 2 weeks, everyone knows, okay, for 2 hours a day, I'm doing interviews. They last about 15 minutes.
And you're doing this after all, they are already in country, so they've already spent the money to be here. So is there something?
No. We're doing this before we let them in. Yep, all with Skype. Yep, no, because we want to, you know, they said, Duke is crazy expensive. The program I work in is $60,000 a year. Like, I could not imagine asking someone to spend that amount of money if they couldn't come here and fully participate and engage, right? I want them to be set up for success. So for me, I kind of feel like it's worth the... No, it's okay.
When do you start these interviews? Like, how much in advance you fall?
So we will start interviewing in February for the fall 2017 term. Yep.
Specific to your program at least, or is that how Duke does it all the way across?
It is how Duke does it for the most part all the way across, but we handle our admissions internally. Mm-hmm. 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 Great question. So we only interview people who on paper we want to let in, right? If that makes sense. So it's sort of like, okay, we're ticking the box. Yep, you're okay, as we thought, right? Or saying, whoa, nope, that didn't work. So I would say, you know, we're probably interviewing 300-ish folks, and I would say of those, maybe 50 get sort of rejected based on interview. Because for the most part, we're really only interviewing the people we want to let in anyway. Yeah. All right, so in the interest of time, is it okay if we, okay, we'll move a little bit forward here. I did want to talk for just a minute about kind of Chinese students specifically and some of the challenges that they have, and share with you just a couple of highlights from the research that I did, working with Chinese students to kind of understand what is most problematic when they come to the US. And essentially, I discovered that the vast majority of students coming from China really underestimate how difficult English is going to be when they get here. And that's because of the way that they have generally learned English is to do really well on the TOEFL, right? Or to do really well on the GRE verbal, not necessarily use English to express an idea or an opinion or to have a small conversation, right? So I think these students tend to feel like, no, I did great on these tests, I'm good to go. Then all of a sudden get here, everything feels really fast. There's a lot of colloquialisms and slang that's coming at them a mile a minute. You know, people are speaking really quickly. In my program, there's also a lot of people for whom English is also a second language and maybe have a heavy accent, and that's hard to understand. So I often sort of, explain this as, the students have all of the grammar that they need. They really have all of the vocabulary that they need. They probably have a better grasp of grammar than many of us in this room, right? Because they've studied it so hard, but don't necessarily know how to sort of put it all together, right? So think about learning to drive in Mayberry, a very kind of clear, easy situation, right? You've got these basic skills, and then suddenly being dropped in downtown Manhattan, right? I think that's what it really feels like for a lot of these students. So they've got it in there, it's just really hard to access it because all of the other sort of external forces make it really challenging. So I want us to try to take a minute to think about what that might feel like. So in a moment, I'm gonna have everybody choose a partner, and what I wanna have you do is have a conversation about what you had for dinner last night. You can talk about who prepared it, what you ate, where you ate, whatever you want. Each person in the partnership has to say 5 complete sentences, and you have to say them backwards. Not the actual word, or not the actual words don't have to be transcribed back, sentences do. So for example, if you wanted to say, Judy and I had a lovely beef Wellington, what you would have to say is, Wellington beef lovely A had I and Judy. Okay? So, choose a partner. Everyone has to say 5 sentences, and we'll come back together as a group in a moment. So please, go ahead. Melanie, I wanted to ask, I know I'm set to go till 9:45. Is that the 15 minutes between 9:45 and 10 a buffer that we can bump into a little bit? Is that okay? Okay, all right, okay. Thank you. Okay, let's come back together as a group. Now that you've talked about your lovely meals that you had last night. Yeah, I know. How was that experience for you? Just shout out some words. Difficult? No adjectives? Okay. What did you say? Frustrating. Yes. Did you feel like you had to edit what you wanted to say? Do you feel like you sounded less sophisticated than you did in your head? Yes. So I know this is sort of silly and really uncomfortable, but I really do feel like this kind of mimics what a lot of Chinese students really feel like when they first get here. When I was doing my research with students, I did a lot of informational kind of interviews with them. And one student said something that really stood out to me. Years later, I still remember it. I was talking to him about group work, which he said was his absolute least favorite thing in the world. I asked him why. And he said, well, the American students just say whatever they think. They just don't even think about whether or not they sound dumb. They just say it, right? Say it out loud. Because it's what we're trained to do, right? We are trained to think out loud. And I said, well, why don't you just sort of jump in, where you can? I mean, that's what they're modeling, and it seems like it's working. And he said, well, I have to think about something 3 times before I would say it in a group. First, to sort of get the idea, then I vet it to myself to make sure that I won't sound stupid if I say it, and I want to make sure it's good for the group for me to say it. Then a 3rd time to translate it from Mandarin to English. Then I wait for a natural break in conversation to express my idea. So think about those things coming into play in group work and how difficult it is for a student to potentially get an idea out, right? A lot of stress for them. And I think a lot of domestic students sometimes mistake a quiet student in a group as someone, oh, well, they don't have any ideas, or they don't know what we're talking about, or they don't, really have anything to add here. And that's not necessarily true. So I actually have all of my domestic students do this exercise, because I think it's really helpful to kind of build some empathy. And I think from there, they know, okay, so if we're in a group, it's not hard to take a minute and say, hey guys, let's just go around one at a time and talk about this. Let's just take a minute to do that, if it seems like someone's not there. And it's been really, really helpful, I think, for improving the group dynamics in a lot of cases. So I think building empathy for this particular challenge is really useful. And these students that I'm dealing with that are having these problems are students who have done really, really well in English, have been interviewed by Duke and done okay, have often taken an ESL class that I'm teaching, and are still having some of these challenges. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. Okay, so I want to really, really quickly have you grab in your packet on the first page here is kind of an opportunity for you to have a couple of self-reflections on your engagement with international students. So think about, and we'll do this really quickly in the interest of time, because I want to make sure we're getting to some solutions here. Take just a minute, write down some of the thoughts in response to these questions, and then we'll come back together as a group. And again, this is not something you'll have to share with anybody, so just, be honest with yourself. All right, in the interest of time, I'm going to sort of plow us ahead here. Does everybody feel like they had a minute to kind of write down where they are right now? Okay, great. So hopefully we will address some of what you've written down and some of what we've talked about earlier here. Before I jump into solutions and some ideas here, your packet does have a little summary of each of the things I'm about to go through, so you can, do whatever, you can follow along with that, make a paper airplane out of it, whatever you want to do. It's fine, but that's free to take with you. And I do want to also mention that, I wish that there were an equation that all of us could follow that would sort of make make this all be easily, attainable for us to make sure that everyone was receiving the wonderful learning that we want to share with them. Not possible, right? The context for this is going to be different for every single one of us. We all have those lenses that we're bringing to the table. All of you have different personality styles and teaching styles. If one of you is teaching quantum physics, you can't really be as creative in your teaching style maybe as someone teaching literature, right? So all of these things come into play. And the other thing that I think is really important to think about in terms of all of this is that this is a moving target. We are never going to be able to check a box and say, okay, we get it, we're good. International students are great in our classroom now. And I think it's really important to think about this as a constantly evolving process and not just something that we have to solve, if that makes sense. And I think since I have sort of shifted to that mindset, I have really enjoyed this more, I think, and really been able to embrace it. So I would encourage you to do the same. Okay. Oop. So I think expectation setting is one of the most important things that we all have to kind of do as educators, right, for any group of students, but particularly for international ones. And I think this goes beyond just laying out expectations for assignments, but being really clear about what you expect to happen in your classroom, right? So if you are someone who really values class participation, it is not necessarily enough to say, you're going to be graded on class participation. You might have to say something like, you will be graded on class participation, and someone who is effective in this regard would probably speak up maybe once a week in class, or would maybe write 3 things on a classroom message board, right? So be really clear about what those expectations are, and make sure that they're outlined in ways. So not just necessarily saying them, making sure they're also maybe in your syllabus or your course website or whatever is applicable in your situation. Checking for understanding is something that I had to learn about really the hard way. I think I often in ESL classes or other classes that I'm teaching will explain a concept or an assignment and say, okay, so is that cool? Everybody understands that? I get a lot of head nods. And then the next day when an assignment's due and no one has turned it in, it is clear to me that that was not understood, right? Part of that has to do with saving face culture. There are a lot of cultures where asking questions, even for clarification, is not really appropriate or well received. And so students aren't necessarily going to tell you if they don't understand. Yes? Yeah, absolutely. That's a fantastic idea. I love it. I'm going to write it down as soon as I finish here. That's a great, great idea. I try to have them reflect it back in some way. Clicker's a great way to do that, quick and easy. Sometimes I'll have a student say, I'll call on someone and say, why don't you explain kind of what you think I've just said to the class? And that's usually really helpful too. In some cases, I might even have them turn in a little written assignment that explains to me, like, okay, I understand that this is what is expected of me in this group. Something like that. I think that's really helpful and something that it does take a little extra time, but I think it's really worth it in the long run. The other thing I want to mention is that you, as I mentioned earlier, are probably more intimidating than you think you are to an international student. So sometimes if you have a TA or a grader that can also be positioned to answer questions for things, that can be really helpful and useful. Cold calling. This is sometimes controversial when I talk about it. I love it. I think it's actually one of the best ways to engage all students, in particular international students, in conversation. When I did my research and I chatted with Chinese students about cold calling and said, how do you feel about it? They all said, well, I never get cold called on. Like the Indian guy maybe to my left does, and the American kid to my right does. I never get called on. And when I asked them why, they said, well, I think they don't want to say my name. They're afraid of saying my name out loud or they don't know it, right? So of course I went to our faculty to ask about this. And yes, in some cases they did say, yeah, I can't, those names are really tough for me, I can't say them. But some of them also very clearly were projecting fear on the part of that student, saying like, well, I feel like the Chinese students are often really like hesitant to speak up and I don't want to put them, in an uncomfortable situation. No, I think that's not an okay approach. I think if cold calling is something that you're doing, it has to happen in a balanced way. And I think for a lot of these students, the limitation is not that they don't have something to say. The limitation is raising the hand, because that's new for a lot of them. And I think if you are cold calling them at the same rate you are cold calling your other students, you are saying to everyone in that classroom, I believe that student has just as much right to be here as you and has intellect as you do. And I think that's really important. And I think the other thing that we have to keep in mind is other cultures are much more silenced than we are. So if you cold call on a student and they don't have something to say right away, I know it's uncomfortable and can feel excruciating sometimes to wait for it, but I think it's important that we do that. maybe for a little longer than we think we might need to with another student. And I also wanted to mention, in terms of addressing the name problem, we now have a culture of name tents in our program where we give them to students at the beginning. If they lose it, they can just make one on notebook paper, and then it's right there. If you all had them right now, I'd be cold calling the heck out of you, right? Because it would be right there, and it would be easy for me to call your name. And the other thing that we have done is to have students, particularly those from China, because those names do seem to be the hardest for most of our faculty, we have some students come do a name coaching session with them at the beginning of the semester. They just buzz through the roster and talk about the student names, and then the faculty will make notes next to the names, and then their roster always has, next to the student name, how they should pronounce it. And that's really helpful, and the Chinese students love doing it. It's a really great way for them to interact with faculty as well. So class participation in general, as we've talked about, going to be new for a lot of folks, and I think you're probably finding that it's a little bit harder sometimes to get those students to participate at the same rate as their domestic counterparts. But I think you can try it in a few ways. Cold calling, I think, is a big success in a lot of cases. It can feel really awkward at first, but students come to expect it, right? And that means that the more you do this at the beginning of the semester, the easier it becomes as time goes on. And so I think building it in, especially at the beginning, makes a huge difference. Also, providing any discussion questions you can, or even just topics ahead of time, so students have a few minutes to kind of research it, or potentially even sending your PowerPoint deck ahead of time if you have it. I mean, I know that's not always applicable, but if you have it and can send it ahead of time, that's really helpful so students can be thinking about how they want to participate. Yes?
My friend, my colleague, he had an Excel sheet, and when he asked a class a question and nobody responds, he kind of makes a scene out of it, goes back to his place, he opens the Excel sheet, and it's like a casino wheel spinning.
Yes.
And then it randomly draws somebody's name and displays like big on the screen.
I love that. Yes.
It's uncomfortable, but making it fun like a casino.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great way to sort of make sure everybody's on their toes. We need to be a little bit hardcore about it, I think. The Fuqua School of Business at Duke, one of the faculty there created an algorithm for cold calling where like they just sort of push a button on an app and it does the same thing where it just pulls up a name and then that's who gets called on. It's pretty interesting. Okay, group work, as we've talked about, I think is really challenging, especially for students who may have a little bit of a language difficulty. And so I think going back to some of what we were talking about earlier with group work, I do think potentially you setting up the groups is probably going to be best because when students self-select, they often might choose based on gender, based on home country, right? So for, in my program, it is not great for a group of Chinese students to all be together in a group because it means they're only speaking in Chinese, right? And that's problematic for a variety of reasons, as you can imagine. Just like I don't want all the domestic students to choose, a group together because they're only getting one perspective. So we have TAs that kind of help us generate groups if it's a class that's really huge and tries to do it based on gender, undergrad degree, coming from, to the best that we can, right? Like I was telling you, my numbers are not evenly balanced, right? So I can't really do that. But we try to do that as best we can. And we try to build in checkpoints to make sure that students that are in leadership roles are getting the support that they need and the respect that they deserve from the groups that they're in and making sure that we're supporting those students. And sometimes we try to build in a leadership rotation so that everybody is getting some opportunities to kind of be in charge of the group for a period of time. Domestic students being involved in these situations can sometimes be problematic. I definitely have had a lot of domestic students over my time at Duke that have come to my office and said, I'm in a group work with these international kids, and that means that I have to, be in charge of it. And I'll say, well, why do you think that? Well, I mean, it's just obvious that I should be in charge of it. And so, sometimes I think it's really important for us to have conversations with these students to explain that, group challenges are not always going to be cultural in nature. I don't know about you, but I've worked in an awful lot of groups with people who look just like me, and it has not gone well. That doesn't necessarily have anything to do with it. And I think it's important for students to understand that and to know that in the working world, we're generally not picking our teams, right? And so we need to sort of be able to work through some of these challenges. I think that's really, really key. And I think, explaining to these students too, who are resistant to it, their ability to work on a multicultural team and to be able to speak to that in an interview process is hugely marketable in pretty much any field, right? That's going to be maybe, except like defense contracting. But in general, I feel like that's going to be a huge, huge advantage to them. And it's going to make them stand out from other students. And sometimes we try to spin it that way. And I think you all have had experience working in multicultural situations, right? That's why you're here. And so I think any context that you can provide, have them do the exercise I just had you do for 2 minutes to understand, like, okay, maybe this is why my group work is not going the way that I want it to. Or maybe I'm misinterpreting the student being quiet or only contributing kind of on the later side in the wrong way, right? Maybe they do actually have something important to say. And I feel like I've had some pretty frank and useful conversations with domestic students about this. So it's been in the long run, I think has been successful. Instructor feedback with regard specifically to how international students are perceiving you, I think is really, really important. And I think it's well worth your time. Having somebody come in, we all get course evaluations at the end of the semester and get some valuable feedback from that. But in general, we're not necessarily getting, feedback from students saying, stop using so many slang words, I don't understand what you mean, right? They're not necessarily going to say that on their evaluation. But someone that's observing might be able to notice that, right, if they're looking for it. So I've put a template in the back of your packet with some questions that someone could ask. You now, within this room, have a group of people that have your shared interests in working with these international students. I feel confident that you could help each other, in this capacity. Or maybe think about having a former student come and think about, specifically kind of what are the things that you're doing that are really great for international students, and maybe what's something small you could change that would really make it so that your message was received. Extracurricular involvement or any kind of involvement with international students outside of class, I think is largely helpful in making them feel comfortable and making you feel connected to them. That is not always possible, right? If you were teaching 200 students in a semester, you're not going to take them all to lunch, right? I get it. But I do think, to the extent that you can find the time to potentially do some small group lunches or maybe some focus groups or something like that could be really helpful. I also think the extent to which you can encourage students to hang out with each other outside of class is really useful. So we've done some peer mentoring that's been successful in some cases, not so much in others. And I think, suggested activities outside of class. So if you're teaching a food politics course and a new documentary has just come out, suggesting to the class that they go together is a great idea, right? And that might students are then also connecting in new and different ways that they wouldn't necessarily while they're sitting in the classroom. And I think that can really build a comfort level for these students, which is a big part of what we're trying to get to, a point where they are comfortable and confident and able to participate. Advising international students, I know, as we have talked about, takes a lot longer, right? For sure it does. And I think it's because of a lot of these reasons that we've talked about, right? They're gonna have a lot more questions. But I also think it's a really great opportunity for you to address some things that may not be being addressed for those students. So, if a student has a language concern, they might be willing to tell you that in a one-on-one situation, right? It might be that you're the only person they can tell about that. And so it's really helpful for you to be able to then say, okay, let's get you some help and support that's gonna kind of get you back on the right track. Time management, as we've talked about, huge challenge for these students, right? So thinking about how you can give them some tips and tricks. What's your calendaring system? Share that with them. Sometimes, I am shocked at the number of students who are sort of like, what do you mean write it down? It seems like pretty obvious to me, but it's just not something they've had to do before. So those kinds of tips I think can be really useful. Making sure that they're, yeah. It is. And I feel like it also happens on a more informal basis too with a lot of our staff as well, who are not even necessarily teaching. It just depends on where the students are most comfortable, where I feel like these things are coming out, if that makes sense. In our program, 50. Yeah, it's about 50 to 1. Mm-hmm. Is that similar to what you're? Yeah. Yes and no. Mm-hmm. Some of us yes, some no. Yeah, and it's hard. I mean, and with some students, some of this may not come up at all, right? But I think looking for it is important and making sure that they feel like they have someone they can talk to about it. What's the what? It depends on who you're talking to. It varies quite a bit. Yeah, it is generally less than that for most people, but it depends a little on which faculty you're talking to. And I think another thing that's really important is really encouraging students to make the most of their time in the US, because I think sometimes They get here with all of these great ideas about what the US is going to be and what their experience is going to be like, and then school is so much harder than they expect, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, I can't go away this weekend to like go, visit Paducah and see what it's all about, right? Because they don't have time to do it, and feel like, oh, I'm just so overwhelmed with work, it's really hard for me to make new friends. And so I think making sure that you're reminding them why they came here. It wasn't just school, right? Part of it was this experience, and making sure that you're trying to support them in that regard. And the other thing that I'll mention is that because mental health has such a stigma so many places, there are a lot of students who may be unwilling to tell you or anyone else that they are suffering from maybe depression or anxiety or something like that. And so, one thing that I have learned kind of through research and experience is that in a lot of cases, mental health issues will manifest themselves as physical symptoms. So a student might come to me and say, oh, I haven't really been sleeping well, and I haven't been eating well, and my stomach's upset, and I've had this headache. And for me, like, to understand, okay, that could be something physical, but this also could be that you are having these other kind of mental issues that you're not dealing with correctly, and that may be part of the challenge here. And so sometimes if that's happening and I send a student to student health, I can call ahead and say, heads up, the student is coming to talk to you. Here's my assessment of the situation. And there has been several cases where we have sort of been able to triage those issues, I think, in a much better way than I would have expected. Campus resources, obviously a huge part of working with international students, right? Language resources in general, kind of support resources, are really, really important. And I think for you, faculty member, understanding what resources exist at Murray State and understanding what they can offer to the students can really help you kind of point them in the right direction, should they need that kind of help. And being able to send them in the right direction, I think, can really be meaningful for them. They might not seek that out unless you point it out to them and sort of advocate for that particular resource. And also, I try to build in required use of some of these resources into my classes. So for example, in my English as a Second Language classes, the students have to visit our communication center to practice any of the speeches that they're going to give, or any papers that they're going to turn in have to go and be edited there. And I have generally found that requiring use of those resources at the beginning means that students say, oh, this is actually really helpful and really useful. I'm going to use this all the time now, and then we'll continue to use it throughout their time at Duke. So I think that's really important. I did want to mention a couple of programmatic changes that we have made at Duke, because I know that we've talked a lot about classroom things, but there are also, I think, some programmatic things that have been really helpful for us that I wanted to share with you. Admissions interviews, we've already talked about. That's definitely something that I highly advocate for. I know that it takes a lot of time, and none of us have any of that these days, but it is really, really useful to know that we are bringing in students who are going to be able to be successful with us. The other thing we try to do is a lot of pre-arrival contact. So because all of our students, or the vast majority, are coming from China and India, I actually go to China and India every summer and interact with our students that are getting ready to come to Duke. And I know that sounds like a crazy, insane, frivolous expense. It's not. Because being able to do that and being able to work out some of these kinks and do some of this advising on the front end means that when the students come, they are so much more ready to just sort of hit the ground running and so much more ready to go. It's shocking to me what sort of preconceived notions they have about the US. Almost every year when I go and I meet with the students one-on-one and I say, what are you thinking about? What's making you nervous as you think about coming to the US? The number one answer, bed bugs. What? That's an easy thing for me to calm you down about. Durham has not had a bed bugs, invasion in quite some time. I don't think that's something you have to be afraid of. And you can just see the shoulders drop. Oh, okay. Well, now that I don't have to worry about that, let's start talking about classes, right? So for us, it's been really, really a valuable, useful tool. And I usually take someone on our staff with me every year, and it's been so helpful for them to also spend time in these countries where our students are coming from and to understand their concept or their context and their perspective a little bit better. That's been really useful for us. If you have any questions about that in greater detail, I'm happy to talk with you afterwards too. We have the guidebook that I wrote for Chinese students. I also bring that to them kind of in person and talk them through how to use it while we're there. And it provides them with kind of a summer's worth of preparatory work to do before they come here. This idea is to sort of address what I was talking about earlier. The students have all of the language skills that they need, they just have not practiced using them. in the way that they would need to be successful here, so it's encouraging that kind of behavior. And we also have an email campaign where we send students over the summer, every week on Wednesday, they'll get an email from us about a different topic. So it could be anything from registering for classes to what kind of, interview wear you would need to pack, right, when you come, right? Understanding what business casual is in the US, what business formal is, that kind of thing. So all different topics. In terms of orientation, we bring our international students in a week before we bring in our domestic students. And there's a number of reasons we do that. The biggest one, honestly, is that it is scientifically proven that for every hour of time difference you experience, it takes a full 24 hours to adjust. So that means if someone's coming from China or even further away, that's 12 days, right, before they're really ready to potentially take on this huge amount of information they're taking. So one thing, we're just building in more time for them. They're also going to have to do things that domestic students won't. They'll need to probably get a new cell phone, set up a bank account, learn how the cable company works. Where I live, it's Time Warner Cable. They're awful. I'm sure whatever you have here is also awful. So getting the sort of to be able to get that set up, they just need more time for that kind of thing. And then we also handle all of their visa stuff while they're here during that time. We do a couple of language workshops. We do a workshop on small talk, right? There's so much about the way we use the English language that's really weird that I feel like I didn't think about until I started working with international students. Our colloquialisms, our slang is really strange. If you think about it, most of our greetings are a question, hey, how are you, what's up, right? We don't really want to know. We're just asking that question as a greeting. Kind of getting the students used to that kind of thing is really useful. And then when the domestic students join them for their second week of orientation, we do a lot of kind of teamwork, prep work with them. So we do the Myers-Briggs type indicator, we do Strengths Finder, we do the intercultural effectiveness scale. We do all these things because we want the students to sort of understand, okay, where am I coming from? What are my strengths? What are my kind of opportunities for development here? What are all these other people bringing to the table? And I feel like this really helps get them ready for group challenges. Completely fix challenges that we have with group work by any means, but I do think it helps. In terms of our English classes, we have really taken a very practical approach. So we are not in class drilling on grammar or on vocabulary. Like I said, I feel like for the vast majority of our students, they've got that. That's all set. What we really need to do is give them practical opportunities to speak. So they are doing most of the talking in those classes. We also do a conversation club with them where on Fridays they come together and all the students are invited in the program and we just pick a topic, right? So maybe it's international fashion, maybe it's pop culture, maybe it's sport, the Olympics, like when that was happening. So just giving the students an opportunity and a topic to chat with each other has built a lot of good community, I think, too, and has really helped those students get more comfortable. And I mentioned a little bit earlier about the resource alignment that we try to do, where we build in the use of resources at the beginning of a semester, and then the students are much more likely to continue utilizing that throughout their time here. Any questions about any of that? Okay, all right. So, we've talked about a lot of things over the last 50 minutes or so. So what I would like to have you do now is in the back of your, I think kind of at the end of where the paragraphs will stop there, take a minute to just jot down a couple of ideas for some things that you could do. There is another list of thoughts for kind of quick implementable things on the last page that you could look at. We've talked about a lot of stuff here. You've maybe been able to chat with some peers about things. And just think about 3 simple things that you could potentially shift. It does not have to be a giant, huge, life-changing thing. It could be something as simple as, maybe, okay, if I make a joke in class, I'm going to explain why it's funny. Because some people might not understand it, right, if they don't have the right context. It could be something as easy as that. But just take a minute to think about some things you could do. You could also take a minute to think, too, about how you might hold yourself accountable to do these things. You've got this room full of people that I think has your shared interest in working with these students in new and different ways. So maybe a lunch every other month to just sort of talk about what's going on with, how you're working with international students now. right. Well, I know we are short on time here, so I'm gonna I'm gonna end there. But I do encourage you to talk about some of those things that you just wrote down with some of your colleagues here, so that you can be sharing best practices. Because I think there's a lot of great ideas probably right here in this room, which is great. So thanks so much for your time and attention, and I hope that this conference is life-changing for you today in some way. Thanks so much.